I remember that freezing January morning in Denver far too clearly. The cold air dried out the city so intensely that every single breath felt like a razor dragging across the back of my throat. I stepped out of the brass-trimmed elevator on the 55th floor of Marston Aerotech, pulled my heavy coat tight around my shoulders, and tried to convince myself that this 8:30 briefing was just another routine operational check. But the unnatural stillness hanging over the executive corridor said otherwise. It was not the crisp silence of professional discipline. It was the suffocating quiet that descends over a building, seconds before an explosive charge detonates. The main conference room on 55 resembled an upscale aviation showroom far more than a practical working space. The central table was carved from a single slab of polished Italian walnut, so long that if someone sitting at the far end whispered an apology, the person near the glass doors would never hear a word. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels overlooked the sprawling skyline of Denver, and further west, the snow-covered peaks of the Rocky Mountains glinted beneath a pale morning sun. Suspended overhead hung a custom crystal chandelier that cost more than half of my annual salary. Everything in that room was meticulously calculated to deliver one unmistakable message. This was a billionaire's personal kingdom, and the king was waiting inside for my arrival. Everett Thorne was already seated at the head of the table, at 61 years old, with sharp silver hair framing his temples, and a broad jawline that flushed deep red whenever his authority was questioned. He carried himself like a monarch accustomed to unthinking obedience. I had spent 13 years of my professional career building operations under this man, learning early on that every executive decision he made was crafted primarily for visual drama. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors, Everett was adjusting his silk necktie, once, twice, then a third time. The repeated gesture was so tense, it looked as though he was unconsciously trying to strangle his own rising anxiety. However, Everett was not the reason I hesitated at the threshold. Sitting directly in my designated chair was Khloe Thorne. Her legs were crossed, her crisp cream blazer was flawlessly pressed, and her lips were painted in a striking shade of dark wine red. Khloe was 31 years old and had been adopted by Everett during his second marriage. She was exceptionally skilled at hosting televised industry panel discussions, brilliant at delivering scripted speeches, and remarkably gifted at pretending she understood the intricate mechanics of defense transport. But in the demanding reality of aerospace supply chain management, Khloe was merely someone attempting to navigate a complex map that she had accidentally held upside down, and now she sat in the exact seat where my laptop and weekly briefs belonged. I pulled out an empty chair 3 spots down and sat down without making a sound. No one in the room spoke. None of the 6 board members seated around the walnut table would meet my eyes. The air felt heavy, carrying the unmistakable weight of a courtroom seconds before a guilty verdict is announced. Everett broke the silence first. His voice sounded deep and measured, yet a layer of contained self-satisfaction vibrated beneath every syllable. "Nolan, thank you for being prompt," he began, resting his manicured hands flat on the table. "I will get straight to the point. The board has reviewed our recent compliance metrics. There is a severe Federal Aviation Administration inspection protocol failure occurring within your area of executive responsibility." I met his gaze steadily. Having spent 13 years managing high-stakes transport crises and defending sensitive military contracts, I understood precisely how unyielding federal regulators could be. I also knew exactly who had authored the internal memo urging our team to skip mandatory safety cross-checks to meet artificial delivery deadlines. That person was sitting directly to Everett's right, twirling a gold pen between her fingers. I calmly asked Everett to specify the exact compliance breach he was referencing. Everett leaned forward, placing his weight on his palms, as if preparing to push an unwanted passenger off the deck of a ship. "There is no need to debate specific details, Nolan. The executive committee has reached a final decision, effective immediately. You have 5 minutes to clear your personal belongings from your desk and surrender your security badge to building officers. 5 minutes. It took me exactly 4 seconds to realize this was not a sudden operational reaction. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver executed to clear a path for his daughter. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a frantic defense. The one thing corporate bullies fear most when staging a public execution is an unshakable inner composure. I allowed a faint, controlled smile to touch the corners of my mouth, the subtle tilt of someone receiving a cup of lukewarm tea they had no intention of drinking. 5 minutes, I said quietly. That is remarkably polite of you, Everett. Khloe raised one manicured eyebrow, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of panic. Everett tugged violently at his tie again, letting out a sharp, audible exhale that betrayed his frustration. I stood up, opened my briefcase, and collected the few personal items sitting on the table. My leather-bound routing ledger, the vintage blue fountain pen I had used for 8 years, and the master project proposal I had submitted the previous afternoon. As I turned toward the exit, I caught my reflection in the glass wall bordering the central hallway. Standing beyond the glass, my operational core team was frozen in place. There was Martha Jenkins, who had managed ground logistics for 40 years. Mateo Delgado, the brilliant young avionics specialist who called his mother in Mexico City during every lunch break. And Audrey Cooper, our unyielding safety auditor, holding a stack of flight manifests with deep confusion written across her face. I walked forward steadily, keeping my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. Behind me, Everett began counting the seconds under his breath, like a man timing a meal in a microwave oven. But with every step I took across that carpeted hallway, the haze of confusion in my colleague's eyes cleared, revealing the stark truth. This was not just a sudden executive shift. It was a deliberate betrayal of operational integrity. To understand how an executive career spanning 13 years collapsed into a 5-minute eviction, one has to look back 3 weeks before that freezing morning. Life in the quiet suburb of Glendale had been peaceful in that fragile way people assume will last indefinitely. Glendale sits just far enough from the urban noise of Denver to feel serene, yet close enough that I could drive into Marston Aerotech's central office in less than 20 minutes. My home was a modest, single-story craftsman structure with a sloped roof and a magnificent old sugar maple tree standing in the front yard. Every autumn, its leaves turned a brilliant crimson, making the yard look as though someone had unrolled a rich carpet straight to the front door. I shared that quiet house with my younger sister, Hannah Vance. Hannah had spent nearly half of her adult life learning how to survive alongside severe rheumatoid arthritis. On the mornings when Hannah could rise from her bed without needing me to twist open her prescription medicine bottles, those were considered triumphant mornings. I would usually hear her slippers dragging softly down the hallway while I brewed black coffee in the kitchen. I am not the sort of executive who routinely brings corporate stress across his home threshold, but one look at Hannah, trying to conceal her joint pain, behind a gentle smile, was always enough to ground me. My career at Marston was never just about professional ambition. It was the financial anchor keeping our domestic life stable. Her peace of mind was the reason I was willing to examine thousands of tedious technical details every day, from defense transport manifests to complex multi-state flight schedules. While the general public imagines aerospace as a glamorous realm of commercial airliners and celebrity pilots, the vast majority of Marston Aerotech's revenue came from classified military logistics contracts that normal civilians never saw. As the senior director of supply chain operations, my primary responsibility was ensuring that high-value cargo, ranging from radar array components to experimental turbine assemblies, moved across state lines precisely on schedule while adhering rigidly to federal safety directives. I maintained absolute oversight over every flight path, payload weight limit, and airspace clearance code. A single unnoticed deviation in routing data could instantly hand a contract worth $100 million directly to our fiercest competitor. For over a decade, I was perfectly content remaining invisible. Corporate press releases glorified executive board members, while I found genuine satisfaction in being the silent engineer managing the machinery behind the curtain. But 4 years ago, when I designed and implemented the Green Line routing algorithm, my standing within the company changed dramatically. The Green Line system was not flashy. It consisted of hundreds of pages of mathematical models, dynamic airspace layering charts, and strict maintenance protocols. Yet, in its very first operational year, the system reduced fuel waste and transit delays by a staggering $120 million. That massive financial return delighted our institutional shareholders, and Everett Thorne lost no time taking center stage at the annual Investor Summit, presenting the Green Line system as if he had personally scribbled the equations on a napkin over lunch. Shortly after the Green Line system went live across all defense contracts, Khloe Thorne began appearing in my operational suite with increasing frequency. Initially, I assumed her presence was a harmless executive formality. At 31, she was polished, camera-ready, and eager to build a high-profile corporate portfolio. One Tuesday morning, wearing expensive French perfume and displaying a smile crafted for trade magazine covers, she walked into my office. She told me she wanted to learn the operational side of aerospace, asking if I would personally mentor her in transport logistics. I believed her sincere intentions. Or rather, I wanted to believe that the founder's daughter genuinely cared about the craft. For several months, I walked her through transport manifests, explained structural payload balances, and emphasized repeatedly why the Federal Aviation Administration was an agency you must never attempt to deceive. She nodded attentively, taking neatly organized notes in a leather journal. However, within a few months, I noticed a subtle and calculated shift. Whenever our division met with high-level military representatives or private aerospace buyers, Khloe was suddenly assigned to deliver the opening presentation. Meanwhile, I was quietly pushed back into the technical seat at the end of the conference table. Industry publications began publishing profiles of Khloe, labeling her the visionary face of next-generation aerospace leadership. The journalists had no idea that just 48 hours prior to those interviews, Khloe had sat in my office asking whether federal flight specters actually noticed minor documentation discrepancies on cargo transports. Then came the Fort Carson operational crisis. Fort Carson represented a crucial $200 million transport contract involving sensitive defense hardware delivered to a military facility in Colorado Springs. Late one Thursday evening, while auditing flight logs, I identified a critical discrepancy in our scheduled landing windows. Being off by a single hour meant our carrier would violate strict military airspace restrictions, triggering automatic federal ground holds. That single error would have delayed the entire supply chain by 3 days, incurred massive financial penalties, and permanently disqualified Marston from future defense bids. No one in executive management was aware of the impending disaster except me. While Khloe was attending an industry gala in Chicago, posting photos from a luxury rooftop lounge, I spent 18 continuous hours locked in my home office. I coordinated directly with air traffic dispatchers in Dallas, recalculated emergency routing paths, adjusted payload weight distributions, and secured updated military clearances. By sunrise, the shipment landed at Fort Carson without a single second of delay. 2 days later, during a mandatory company-wide executive assembly, I took a seat near the back of the auditorium, holding my technical post-analysis report. The opening slide flashed onto the massive projection screen. A high-resolution photograph of Khloe standing beside a military transport container, accompanied by the bold caption, "The Fort Carson Operational Initiative, led by Khloe Thorne." Everett stood proudly at the podium, spending 20 minutes praising his daughter's exceptional leadership in overseeing the routing strategy. He did not utter a single word about the critical system failure I had caught. He made no mention of the sleepless night I had spent saving the contract from total forfeiture. I sat in the dark auditorium and said nothing. Across the room, Khloe caught my gaze. Her expression was not one of gratitude or quiet embarrassment. It was a cold, calculating message that she had successfully maneuvered another step ahead on the corporate board. As the audience applauded, I slipped quietly out the side exit. I felt no burning rage, only a sobering realization. In an enterprise where accolades are routinely claimed by those who stand before the cameras, the technicians who fix the catastrophic errors will always be forced into the shadows. But I also knew that when you build an empire on stolen foundation stones, the entire structure becomes remarkably fragile. Structural collapses in major corporations rarely happen overnight. They begin with small, quiet compromises that executives choose to ignore until the entire framework gives way. For me, the final rift with Marston Aerotech began on a bright Wednesday morning when Khloe walked into my office holding a thick stack of newly printed policy proposals. "Nolan, we need to discuss a major strategic shift," she announced, sitting down across from me with an air of unshakable authority. "I have been analyzing our client feedback metrics, and our compliance review cycles are far too sluggish. I am proposing that we streamline our FAA inspection protocols. If we bypass a few redundant ground checks, we can accelerate our delivery schedules by nearly 20%. I laid my pen flat on the desk and looked at her intently. She had been with the company for 3 years, yet the reckless ease with which she spoke about federal regulations made me wonder if she truly understood what she was proposing. I asked her to specify exactly which inspection steps she considered redundant. She answered instantly, without a moment of hesitation. The secondary structural load verifications, the pre-flight avionics cross-checks, and the manual system log reviews. If our ground crews report no visible issues, we should authorize immediate takeoff, rather than waiting 2 hours for a certified inspector's sign-off. I had to exert immense self-control to keep from laughing aloud. Khloe spoke as if the Federal Aviation Administration were a local social club with optional guidelines. She completely failed to grasp that a single unverified cargo weight calculation could cause a transport aircraft to destabilize during high-altitude turbulence over mountain ranges. "This is not a software startup where you can release a broken patch and fix it later," I told her, keeping my tone deadly serious. "Cutting mandatory FAA inspection steps means putting our flight crews in danger and placing the entire company straight into a federal prosecutor's crosshairs." Khloe frowned, not because she recognized the immense legal hazard, but because my refusal threatened her pre-packaged presentation. She offered a series of buzzword-heavy corporate arguments about agility and modern market disruption before storming out of my office, clearly viewing me as an outdated dinosaur, obstructing her path to executive glory. 48 hours later, Everett convened an extraordinary board meeting to evaluate Khloe's proposal. I arrived early and took my usual seat at the perimeter table. When Khloe delivered her presentation, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, I noticed board member Lyle Preston leaning forward attentively. Lyle was infamous for claiming that modern corporations must embrace bold risks to maximize quarterly dividends. Bold, in Lyle's vocabulary, invariably meant cutting operational safety to pad profit margins. Lyle nodded enthusiastically throughout her presentation. "Brilliant strategy," he declared, slapping his palm on the table. "We cannot allow bureaucratic overregulation to slow down our growth velocity." He never asked which specific safety checks were being eliminated. He never consulted federal aviation statutes. His heavy equity portfolio did all the thinking for him. When Everett called on me for an operational assessment, I delivered a single unvarnished sentence: "There is no legal or safe method to bypass mandatory FAA inspection protocols, and if we attempt to do so, federal authorities will ground our fleet within 48 hours. Lyle looked at me as though I had committed corporate treason. "Nolan, you have always been overly conservative," he sneered. "Leaders find ways to deliver results, not excuses." I remained silent. When short-term greed takes the helm, logic is discarded overboard. Later that afternoon, an urgent internal message appeared in my inbox. The sender had meant to route it directly to Everett, but inadvertently copied my department alias. It was an executive memo written by Khloe. She argued that my rigid adherence to FAA compliance had become a severe barrier to corporate innovation. She recommended reassigning me to an obscure advisory role and elevating her to head of global operations immediately. I read the memo twice. I felt no panic, only a profound freezing clarity. This was how Khloe intended to secure her coronation, by framing safety compliance as insubordination. I locked my office door, pulled my secure external hard drive from the wall safe, and began copying every operational log, every email exchange regarding Khloe's proposal, and every digital record associated with the Fort Carson fix. Experience in corporate logistics had taught me long ago that when corrupt managers prepare to leap off a cliff, they always try to push the technical lead off first. Which brings us back to that freezing morning on the 55th floor. when Everett gave me 5 minutes to clear my desk. After stepping out of the conference room, I took the elevator down to the 18th floor, where my operational team was stationed. The main floor was usually a chaotic engine of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and rapid logistics updates. But that morning, total silence reigned. Word of my termination had already swept through the building like a shockwave. As I walked toward my office to grab my coat, Martha Jenkins stood up from her desk. Martha was 63 years old and had managed dispatch schedules long before Marston Aerotech became a publicly traded entity. She picked up her favorite red pen, placed it deliberately in her drawer, and looked me in the eye. I refuse to work for an executive suite that sacrifices human life for corporate speed, Martha said, her voice echoing across the silent floor. She grabbed her purse and walked straight to my side. Next was Mateo Delgado. He stood up, unclipped his security badge, and walked directly to the glass office where Khloe was standing, watching in horror. Mateo placed his badge flat against the glass window, then let it fall to the floor. Within 30 seconds, a sudden chorus of sharp snaps filled the room, as laptop screens were slammed shut across the entire floor. One after another, 20 senior logistics coordinators, avionics technicians, and safety compliance officers stood up from their desks. They were not walking out because of a personal loyalty to me. They were walking out because they realized that if a 49-year-old director with 13 years of flawless service could be discarded for refusing to break federal law, none of them were safe. Everett came rushing down the stairwell, his face purple with rage, his tie completely crooked. "Stop this madness immediately," he screamed, his voice cracking as he tried to project authority. "If you walk out those doors, you are all terminated without severance." No one turned back. 20 highly skilled professionals walked steadily toward the express elevators. Everett lunged toward me, grabbing my shoulder. "Nolan, you have to order them back to their stations." I looked down at his trembling hand, then up into his frantic eyes. "I don't control these people, Everett," I replied calmly. "I simply did my job with integrity. They are doing theirs." As the elevator doors closed between us, Everett Thorne no longer looked like a powerful billionaire CEO. He looked like a panicked child who had set his own house on fire and could not understand why the water hose was empty. The drive back to Glendale after the mass walkout felt surreal. For 13 years, my life had been governed by the relentless rhythm of Marston Aerotech's operations. Now, the highway stretched out before me like an unmarked runway. When I walked through my front door, Hannah looked up from her knitting in surprise. "You're home early, Nolan," she said softly. I forced a smile, hung up my coat, and sat down beside my sister. "The meeting ended a bit sooner than expected," I replied gently. She studied my face for a long moment, recognizing the exhaustion etched around my eyes, but she refrained from asking probing questions. Instead, she quietly went to the kitchen and prepared a mug of hot ginger tea. Before I could take a sip, my mobile phone began buzzing continuously on the coffee table. Messages flooded the screen from news reporters, industry contacts, and former colleagues. Then, an incoming call displayed a name I did not expect. Julian Ross. Julian was Marston's chief in-house legal counsel. He was a brilliant, pragmatic attorney who rarely called anyone outside of formal executive sessions. "Nolan, I am calling you from my personal line," Julian said. His voice dropped to a low whisper. "I am not speaking as Marston's corporate representative right now. I am calling as someone who respects your work." I sat up straight. "What is happening, Julian?" "Listen to me very carefully," Julian continued. "When Everett drew up your executive employment contract 6 years ago, he included a standard executive protection clause, specifically a hostile public termination clause. If the chief executive dismisses a senior director in a manner that publicly damages their professional's reputation without prior board trial or documented cause, the executive is entitled to an immediate structural buyout." "How significant is that buyout?" I asked. Julian did not hesitate. "Given your 13-year tenure and the public nature of your firing in front of the board, the contractual liability exceeds several $1,000,000. And if you file a formal whistleblower complaint with the FAA regarding Khloe's proposal, Marston will be facing federal sanctions." "Why are you telling me this, Julian?" "Because I have no intention of sinking with Everett's sinking ship. Julian admitted bluntly, and because everyone in legal knows you saved the Fort Carson contract last month. My advice? Do not sign any severance paperwork from Marston, retain a top-tier labor attorney immediately, and preserve every byte of data regarding Khloe's safety bypass attempt. When the call ended, a profound sense of relief washed over me. The very corporate machinery Everett had built to protect his empire was about to dismantle it. The following morning, my small living room in Glendale transformed into an emergency operational command center. Martha, Mateo, Audrey, and 17 other former Marston employees arrived at my house carrying laptops, folding chairs, and thick binders. Hannah bustled through the room, happily keeping everyone supplied with fresh tea and breakfast sandwiches. "We don't need 50 floors of Italian walnut to manage logistics," Martha declared, spreading a massive map of the Denver metropolitan area across my dining table. "We have 40 years of collective experience, direct relationships with transport carriers, and absolute technical integrity." By afternoon, Mateo identified an affordable commercial lease, an old, sturdy brick warehouse situated near Centennial Airport. The building had concrete floors, exposed steel trusses, and a faded metal roof, but it sat directly adjacent to major air freight corridors. We leased the facility that very evening, naming our new enterprise Horizon Logistics. Word of our sudden independence spread rapidly through the aerospace sector. On our third day at the warehouse, a dark blue luxury vehicle pulled up to the loading dock. A tall, sharp-eyed man in a tailored leather jacket stepped out. He introduced himself as Desmond Pierce, a prominent venture capitalist from Dallas, specializing in defense infrastructure investments. "I heard about the walkout at Marston," Desmond said, walking around our bustling warehouse floor and inspecting our setup. "I don't invest in flashy PowerPoint presentations, Mr. Vance. I invest in battle-tested teams with unshakable standards. What are your capital requirements?" I looked Desmond straight in the eye. "We operate strictly by federal safety guidelines, Mr. Pierce. We do not cut inspection corners to pad margins, and we do not alter compliance reports for any investor. If you are seeking quick profits at the expense of safety, you are in the wrong building." Desmond let out a rich laugh. "If you were willing to compromise, I wouldn't have driven here from the airport." He pulled out a checkbook and executed an initial seed investment of $150,000 on the spot, with a commitment for institutional funding once operational milestones were met. With seed capital secured, Horizon Logistics went live. However, Everett Thorne and Khloe were not willing to let us build in peace. Within 48 hours, Marston's legal team issued cease-and-desist warnings, alleging unfair competition, while Lyle Preston personally telephoned our prospective military clients, threatening to revoke their equipment warranties if they partnered with Horizon. To counter their backroom intimidation, I accepted an invitation to appear on a respected regional business broadcast filmed in Denver. The interview was targeted primarily toward senior industry executives and regulatory veterans. Sitting beneath the warm studio lights, I refrained from launching personal attacks against Everett or Khloe. Instead, I conducted a masterclass on federal aviation safety protocols. Using a whiteboard, I systematically demonstrated why skipping ground inspection checks exponentially increases catastrophic failure risks during flight operations. Why do some corporate executives attempt to shorten these procedures? The television host asked. Because on a quarterly financial ledger, bypassing a safety check looks like saved time and increased profit, I answered clearly, looking directly into the primary camera lens. But in the real world of aerospace, every safety regulation is written in the hard lessons of past disasters. When you trade regulatory compliance for short-term visual success, you are not innovating, you are simply gambling with human lives. The broadcast aired that evening, and the industry reaction was swift and overwhelming. Defense contractors who had been pressured by Marston realized instantly that Horizon possessed the genuine technical authority. The following morning, Colonel Wallace from the Fort Carson procurement office called my personal phone. "Nolan, we watched your broadcast," the colonel said firmly. "We are officially reassigning our regional logistics oversight contract to Horizon Logistics, effective immediately." We prefer working with professionals who understand flight physics over executives who only understand public relations. The final collapse of Everett Thorne's empire occurred with shocking speed. 1 week after my television interview, the Federal Aviation Administration released its comprehensive investigative report regarding Marston Aerotech. The findings were devastating. Federal auditors confirmed that Khloe Thorne had systematically authorized illegal inspection shortcuts on civilian cargo transports. The federal agency issued an immediate directive freezing Marston's primary transport licenses and assessing massive financial penalties. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, emergency financial news broadcasts reported that Marston Aerotech's stock value had plummeted by 40% in a single trading session. Facing immense pressure from institutional shareholders, the board convened an emergency session. By 4 o'clock, the official press release was issued. Everett Thorne had been permanently removed from his role as chief executive officer, and Khloe Thorne was hit with a 5-year federal ban prohibiting her from holding any executive or managerial position within the aerospace logistics sector. Lyle Preston, the board member who had so enthusiastically endorsed Khloe's reckless proposal, appeared on financial television looking pale and disheveled. "We were severely misled by incompetent operational leadership," Lyle claimed pathetically, attempting to shield himself from legal liability. That evening, as I sat in my office at the Centennial Warehouse, reviewing flight schedules, my mobile phone rang. The display showed an unlisted number. When I answered, the voice on the other end sounded frail, hollow, and completely broken. "Nolan, it's Everett," he said softly. The background noise suggested he was standing alone somewhere outdoors, far from the polished halls of the 55th floor. I remained silent, holding the receiver to my ear. "I am calling to apologize," Everett continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I allowed personal ambition and family favoritism to cloud my judgment. I ruined everything we spent 13 years building. The board has asked me to reach out to you. If you return to Marston as chief executive officer, we will grant you full operational autonomy and total equity control." I looked out my office window at our brightly lit warehouse floor where Martha, Mateo, Audrey, and 20 dedicated professionals were seamlessly coordinating freight movements for our growing list of national clients. "I am not returning, Everett," I replied calmly. "You cannot rebuild an empire on broken trust, and I have already built a home where integrity comes first." Everett let out a long, shuddering sigh. "I understand," he whispered quietly before hanging up the phone. 2 weeks later, Horizon Logistics finalized its Series A funding round, backed by Desmond Pierce and a syndicate of national aerospace investors. Based on our secured defense contracts and rapidly expanding commercial operations, independent financial auditors officially valued Horizon Logistics at $50 million. We celebrated our achievements by opening our state-of-the-art corporate headquarters located just 3 blocks from our original warehouse near Centennial Airport. The new facility featured open wooden architecture, natural sunlight streaming through panoramic windows, and advanced logistics tracking centers. On opening day, our entire workforce assembled in the main atrium. I stood before the 20 men and women who had walked out of Marston Aerotech alongside me on that freezing January morning. None of us wore expensive silk ties or tailored executive blazers, but every person in that room carried the quiet pride of individuals who had refused to compromise their principles. I did not deliver a scripted corporate speech. Instead, I looked at each of their faces and spoke from the heart. "They gave us 5 minutes to leave a billionaire's boardroom," I said, my voice echoing warmly across the sunlit atrium. They thought 5 minutes was enough time to erase 13 years of hard work. But what they failed to realize is that true authority does not come from a walnut table or a 55th floor view. It comes from the skill in your hands and the integrity in your character. The entire atrium erupted into sustained applause. Martha smiled through happy tears, Mateo raised a thumb in victory, and Hannah sat in the front row, looking at me with radiant warmth. As the afternoon sun dipped below the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, painting the Denver sky in rich shades of gold and crimson, I looked out toward the runway of Centennial Airport. A cargo aircraft bearing the Horizon Logistics emblem taxied smoothly down the tarmac, its engines roaring with steady power before lifting gracefully into the clear blue sky. My journey at Marston had ended in 5 tense minutes. But standing here today, surrounded by people who valued truth above convenience, I knew our true flight was only just beginning.